Hello and welcome to Quiz Class. I'm your host, Ellen, and today we have 100 questions on the 1960s. Let's take a look at our Quiz Class awards. Let us know how you rank in the comments at the end, along with the answer to the bonus question. And let's begin. Which band's debut album was titled The Piper at the Gates of Dawn? The Who, Pink Floyd, or The Kinks? Pink Floyd. What was the name of the first artificial satellite launched by the US in 1958? Explorer 1, Vanguard 1, or Sputnik 1? Explorer 1. Which actress played both Eliza Doolittle and Mary Poppins in the 1960s? Debbie Reynolds, Audrey Hepburn, or Julie Andrews? Julie Andrews. What was the name of the first supermarket barcode system introduced in the late 1960s? UPC, Codabar, or CarTrack? CarTrack. Which philosopher's concept of the medium is the message gained popularity in the 1960s? Noam Chomsky, Herbert Marcuse, or Marshall McLuhan? Marshall McLuhan. What was the original name of the band that became the Grateful Dead? The Wildflowers, the Warlocks, or the Deadbeats? The Warlocks. Which 1960s film featured the line, "What we've got here is failure to communicate"? Cool Hand Luke, Bullet, or The Great Escape? Cool Hand Luke. What was the name of the first computer mouse invented in 1964? Apple Lisa mouse, XY position indicator for display system, or Xerox Alto mouse? XY position indicator for display system. What was the name for the first human-made object to reach the surface of the moon? Luna 1, Apollo 11, or Luna 2? Luna 2. Which 1960s band was originally called the Gollywogs? The Animals, Creedence Clearwater Revival, or the Byrds? Creedence Clearwater Revival. Which 1960s film won the most Academy Awards? My Fair Lady, Lawrence of Arabia, or West Side Story? West Side Story. Which 1960s band was originally called the Quarrymen? The Who, the Rolling Stones, or the Beatles? The Beatles. Which 1960s film featured the character of Mrs. Robinson? Bonnie and Clyde, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, or The Graduate? The Graduate. What was the name of the first handheld electronic calculator introduced in 1967? Caltech, Sharp L8, or Casio 14A? Caltech. Which 1960s TV show featured a talking horse? Flipper, Lassie, or Mr. Ed? Mr. Ed. What was the original name of the band Strawberry Alarm Clock? The Strawberries, the Sixpence, or the Alarm Clocks? The Sixpence. Which 1960s film featured the song Moon River? Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady, or Mary Poppins? Breakfast at Tiffany's. Which 1960s TV show featured a family traveling in outer space? The Jetsons, Star Trek, or Lost in Space? Lost in Space. What was the name of the first commercially successful laser invented in 1960? Ruby laser, carbon dioxide laser, or helium neon laser? Ruby laser. Which 1960s film featured the character of Holly Golightly? Bonnie and Clyde, Breakfast at Tiffany's, or The Graduate? Breakfast at Tiffany's. Which 1960s TV show featured a car that could fly and turn into a submarine? Supercar, Thunderbirds, or The Jetsons? Supercar. What was the name of the first commercially available light-emitting diode in 1962? Ruby LED, GASP LED, or SNX 100? SNX 100. Which 1960s band included a member who played the theremin? The Beach Boys, the Yardbirds, or Pink Floyd? The Beach Boys. What was the name of the first computer programming language designed for children, created in 1967? Scratch, Logo, or Pascal? Logo. Which 1960s film featured a fictional soft drink called Gwyneth Beer? Easy Rider, 2001: A Space Odyssey, or Dr. Strangelove? Dr. Strangelove. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric toothbrush introduced in 1961? Waterpik, Broxident, or Sonicare? Broxident. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could shrink to the size of an atom? Land of the Giants, Lost in Space, or The Twilight Zone? Land of the Giants. What was the original name of the artificial sweetener aspartame when it was discovered in 1965? Equal, ZK55837, or Sweet and Low? ZK55837. Which 1960s band recorded a song about a real-life disaster at a coal mine in Aberfan, Wales? The Who, the Kinks, or the Bee Gees? The Bee Gees. Question 30. Which 1960s film featured a fictional soft drink called Pepsi Paradiso? A Pig Panther, A Hard Day's Night, or 1, 2, 3? One, two, three. What was the name of the first commercially available handheld hairdryer introduced in 1960? Revlon, Koken, or Conair? Koken. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could teleport by thinking himself to another location? My Favorite Martian, I Dream of Jeannie, or Bewitched? My Favorite Martian. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Frisbee? Whirly Bird, Pluto Platter, or Flying Saucer? Pluto Platter. What was the name of the first commercially successful robotic toy introduced in 1961? Robot Commando, Omnibot, or Furby? Robot Commando. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of cigarettes called Morley? The Twilight Zone, the movie, Breakfast at Tiffany's, or Psycho? The Twilight Zone, the movie. What was the name of the first successful cochlear implant developed in the late 1960s? Nucleus, Clarion, or House 3M? House 3M. What was the original name of the game that became known as Twister? Tangled, Avoid, or Pretzel? Avoid. Which 1960s band included a song with lyrics entirely in Esperanto on one of their albums? Them, the Kinks, or the Zombies? Them. Which 1960s film featured a fictional soft drink called Elsinore Beer? The Party, Dr. Strangelove, or Strange Brew? Strange Brew. What was the original name of the toy that became known as Etch-a-Sketch? Draw-O-Matic, L'écran Magique, or Magic Screen? L'écran Magique. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could change into any animal by drinking a special potion? Bewitched, Manimal, or The Addams Family? Manimal. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric can opener introduced in 1961? Krups, Black & Decker, or Unico? Unico. Which 1960s band recorded a song about a real-life nuclear submarine disaster? The Monkees, the Animals, or the Doors? The Monkees. What was the original name of the game that became known as Operation? Cavity Sam, Body Shop, or Death Valley? Death Valley. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of cigarettes called Strand? Blow Up, The Ipcress File, or Darling? The Ipcress File. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric carving knife introduced in 1963? Cuisinart, Hamilton Beach, or Sunbeam? Hamilton Beach. Which 1960s band had a hit song inspired by a newspaper article about a highway bridge collapse? Simon and Garfunkel, The Kinks, or The Doors? Simon and Garfunkel. What was the name of the first commercially available instant mashed potato product introduced in 1962? Cadbury's Smash, Idahoan, or Hungry Jack? Cadbury's Smash. What was the original name of the artificial fabric later known as spandex? Lastane, Fiber K, or Lycra? Fiber K. Question 50. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric pencil sharpener? Panasonic, Boston, or Statler? Panasonic. Which 1960s band included a song with lyrics entirely in Latin on one of their albums? Jefferson Airplane, The Electric Prunes, or The Zombies? The Electric Prunes. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Super Ball? Hypersphere, Bouncy Ball, or Zectron? Zectron. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could control electronics with his mind? Lost in Space, My Living Doll, or The Outer Limits? My Living Doll. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric food slicer for home use introduced in 1964? Rival, Krups, or Braun? Rival. What was the original name of the game that became known as Yahtzee? Poker Dice, Five Dice, or the Yacht Game? The Yacht Game. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of cigarettes called Alpines? The Graduate, The Manchurian Candidate, or Psycho? The Manchurian Candidate. What was the original name of the artificial sweetener, later known as cyclamate? Michael's compound, saccharyl, or a sugarin? Michael's compound. Which 1960s band included a song with lyrics entirely in French on their debut album? The Yardbirds, The Animals, or Soft Machine? Soft Machine. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric shoe polisher introduced in 1962? Ronson, Griffin, or Kiwi? Ronson. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of beer called Narragansett? Easy Rider, Jaws, or The Wild Angels? Jaws. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Slinky Dog? Elastic Hound, Coil Canine, or Slinky Train? Slinky Train. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric fondue pot introduced in 1965? Oster, Rival, or Cuisinart? Rival. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could travel through time using a special belt? Voyagers, Doctor Who, or The Time Tunnel? Voyagers. What was the original name of the artificial fabric later known as Kevlar? DuPont 729, Fiber B, or Fiber 29? Fiber 29. Which 1960s band included a song with lyrics entirely in German on one of their albums? The Rolling Stones, the Monks, or the Beatles? The Monks. Which 1960s TV show featured a car that could drive itself and talk? My Mother the Car, Supercar, or My Living Doll? My Living Doll. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Barbie's Dream House? Barbie's Dream Home, Barbie's Dollhouse, or Barbie's Palace? Barbie's Dream Home. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could teleport by snapping his fingers? The Outer Limits, The Tomorrow People, or Bewitched? The Tomorrow People. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of cigarettes called Lark? Dr. Strangelove, Breakfast at Tiffany's, or Psycho? Dr. Strangelove. What was the original name of the game that became known as Battleship? Broadsides, Naval Combat, or Salvo? Salvo. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could freeze time by pressing his watch? The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., The Twilight Zone, or Time Tunnel? The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of beer called Rain Gold? Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, or The Graduate? Midnight Cowboy. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Easy Bake Oven? Safety Bake, Kenner's Kitchen, or Little Chef? Safety Bake. What was the original name of the game that became known as Twister? Contortionist, Tangled, or Avoid? Avoid. That was a freebie for you. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could shrink to microscopic size? Fantastic Voyage, Lost in Space, or The Outer Limits? Fantastic Voyage. Which 1960s film featured a fictional brand of cigarettes called Strand? A Hard Day's Night, Darling, or The Impress File? The Impress File. What was the original name of the toy that became known as the Light Bright? Glow Peg, Apollo Lightbox, or Bright Ideas? Apollo Lightbox. Which 1960s TV show featured a character who could communicate with animals telepathically? Daktari, Lassie, or Flipper? Daktari. What was the name of the first commercially successful electric pasta maker for home use? Atlas, Imperia, or Simac? Simac. What type of hat became a symbol of revolution and resistance during the 1960s? Cloche, beret, or the pillbox hat? The beret. Question 81. Which First Lady's fashion choices heavily influenced 1960s women's fashion? Jacqueline Kennedy, Pat Nixon, or Eleanor Roosevelt? Jacqueline Kennedy. Which spacecraft carried the first American to orbit the Earth? Apollo 11, Friendship 7, or Gemini 4? Friendship 7. What cocktail became popular in the 1960s partly due to James Bond films? Vodka martini, margarita, or old-fashioned? Vodka martini. Who wrote the best-selling novel Valley of the Dolls in 1966? Betty Friedan, Harper Lee, or Jacqueline Sussman? Jacqueline Sussman. Which art movement characterized by optical illusions gained popularity in the 60s? Op art, pop art, or surrealism? Pop art. What was the name of the first woman in space? Eileen Collins, Sally Ride, or Valentina Tereshkova? Valentina Tereshkova. Which iconic sports car was first introduced in 1963? Ford Mustang, Dodge Charger, or the Porsche 911? The Porsche 911. Who became the first African American to win the Masters Golf Tournament in 1961? Lee Elder, Charles Sifford, or Tiger Woods? Charles Sifford. Which influential environmental book was published by Rachel Carson in 1962? Walden, The Limits to Growth, or Silent Spring? Silent Spring. Which team won the first Super Bowl in 1967? The Kansas City Chiefs, the New York Jets, or the Green Bay Packers? The Green Bay Packers. What major educational TV show for children debuted in 1969? Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, or Captain Kangaroo? Sesame Street. Which dystopian novel by Anthony Burgess was published in 1962? Fahrenheit 451, 1984, or A Clockwork Orange? A Clockwork Orange. Which popular snack food was introduced in 1964? Doritos, Pop-Tarts, or Cheetos? Pop-Tarts. Who created the famous Campbell's Soup Can series in 1962? Roy Lichtenstein, David Hockney, or Andy Warhol? Andy Warhol. Which standardized test for college admissions was first administered in 1964? ACT, SAT, or GRE? The ACT. Which activist delivered the I Have a Dream speech in 1963? Rosa Parks, John Lewis, or Martin Luther King Jr.? Martin Luther King Jr. What major environmental disaster occurred in Santa Barbara, California in 1969? Nuclear meltdown, forest fire, or oil spill? Oil spill. Which programming language, still widely used today, was developed in the mid-60s? Python, Java, or BASIC? BASIC. What was the name of the 1965 Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery? Freedom Ride, Birmingham Campaign, or Bloody Sunday? Bloody Sunday. Which iconic fashion item was introduced by designer Mary Quant in the 1960s? Bell-bottom pants, the miniskirt, or tie-dye shirts? The miniskirt. And for our bonus question, what groundbreaking medical procedure was first successfully performed by Dr. Christian Barnard in 1967? Let us know the answer in the comments and, of course, how well you did with our quiz class Einstein Rewards. Thanks for playing this quiz. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.